Hi, I'm Jacob. This is Blender.
Cope.
So, we have a cube. When most people start Blender, they usually get rid of this cube, but I won't because he's my son. Now that we have this cube, you can use the middle mouse button to orbit around your scene. You can scroll in to zoom in. If you hold shift and use the middle mouse key, this allows you to pan around your scene. By holding control and clicking in the middle mouse key, it allows you to sharply zoom. Extendo zooms. To enter selection mode, hit the tab key. While in this mode, you can select faces, edges, or vertices. To move things around, use the move tool by hitting G. Extrude with the E key. You'll be able to extend vertices, make edges longer, and later in the video, we're going to talk more about extrusion types. The scale tool makes things bigger or smaller. This can include a plane, or if it's an edge, an entire object. You can scale along the X, Y, and Z axis. To select multiple things at once, hit Shift and the left mouse key. This is the multi-selection tool. By holding Control and the left mouse button, you can use the path selection tool. This is more of a directed way of selecting where you can get a specified line from one edge to the other. And just like most of the tools here, this works for edges, vertices, faces, or objects. Well, not objects. To duplicate an object, hit Shift D. When you create a duplicate, the duplicate will always remain separate from the original geometry. So when you edit the duplicate, it's going to have different properties than the one that you started with. To inset an object, hit the I key. This allows you to create additional edges inside of your meshes. You can then later extrude those insets and create a lot of really intricate designs. This, along with the multi-select tool and extrude, makes it a really good choice for hard poly modeling, which is when you edit the actual geometry of your meshes instead of changing it through things like modifiers, which we will talk about in another video. There's also a really interesting way that you can use the duplicate tool. You can use it to create additional meshes. This comes in handy when you don't want to be dealing with a million objects all the time, because that can get a little cumbersome in times. And in order to select the new meshes that you've created, hit the L key. This is the mesh selection tool. This is the mesh selection. This is the mesh select. This is the mesh select tool. Cool. Now I know they sound the same, but an instance is a little different from a duplicate in the sense that when you create an instance by hitting Alt-D, you can create a copy of the object, but when you edit the copy, it will also change the information of the first object. By hitting the Z key, you open up the render wheel, and by doing this, you can access the rendered mode, the flat shaded mode, the wireframe mode, and the solid mode. You're going to be using this one a lot. By hitting Control R, you can add loop cuts to your objects, which essentially creates a full edge all around the shape of your object. This can be really good when trying to subdivide your model so that you give yourself more geometry and more flexibility when you're doing stuff like making a house or trying to build a cool hammer. Now, if you're trying to extrude something outward from faces that are pointing in different directions, this can be kind of tricky because extrude will just push all of the faces to one edge or one side, whereas extruding from normals, which you can do by hitting Alt-E, will extrude from the direction of every face in a very seamless way. This is really good for creating edges on things like walls or this castle, for instance. A different type of extrusion that you might do, and my personal favorite, is extrude manifold. With this extrusion tool, you can push faces inside and outside of your model to carve into it, which is something that is more difficult with classic extrusion because it creates a lot of sort of hanging faces and it's just really ugly. I recommend you try it. It's bleh. But extrude manifold is extremely good for creating architecture or quickly blocking out an object. I use it a lot in my work. Another cool thing to note when using the move tool is if you hit X, Y, or Z, you can lock objects onto paths while you're moving them or scaling them or extruding. Comes in handy quite a bit. To bevel an object, hit Shift B. This allows you to create additional faces on the edges of objects, creating this cool little bevel. Bevels are especially useful when creating things like roofs or if you're trying to create a slanted surface. You can adjust your bevel as well by going into the tool settings bar on the far left-hand corner. There you'll be able to adjust the width of your bevel as well as the number of segments present. This is a really good way to create curves and rounded objects in your model. These bevels can be created inside of crevices in your model as well as outside. A lot of the times modelers will bevel the edges of their objects on things like chests or furniture to give it more of a realistic feel. You can use the knife tool to cut into your object if you want a very specific shape or if you're trying to divide it in a particular way. This is a more haphazard way of cutting into your object than, for instance, something like a loop cut, but it does the job. The number pad is also a way that you can use to navigate navigate your scene. For instance, by hitting 4 and 6 on the number pad, you can go left and right in your scene, whereas hitting 8 or 2 will have you going up and or down. When you hit 7, you will go on the top orthographic view. If you hit 9, you'll go on the bottom orthographic view. For 3, you go to the right, and for 1, you go to the front. If you hit 5, you will enable either perspective view or orthographic view. And generally, orthographic view is more boxy with more straight vertical lines. If you want to separate something in your object, like the plane or edge of a mesh, hit the Y key. This will allow you to separate anything from the mesh that you're working on. This can be especially useful if you're trying to create things like windows and doors or anything that you need to be separate. There's also a feature in Blender to fly around the scene. You can do this by hitting the Control and the tilde key. This will allow you to fly around using the WASD keys. You can hit E to go up and Q to go down. By scrolling up and down on the middle mouse wheel, you can control the speed at which you navigate this liminal space. By hitting the Tab key while you're in fly mode, it will enable gravity and you will fall, which is always very funny. By adjusting the scroll wheel on the middle mouse button, you can adjust the speed at which you walk, and by holding Shift to allow yourself to run, analogous to how fast you're going. The bridge tool allows you to connect two faces, edges, or vertices from very far away into one cohesive mesh. This can be done by hitting the right mouse button and scrolling to the Bridge Edges option. You can access this feature by clicking the right mouse button and scrolling down to where it says Bridge Faces. I believe this can also be done with edge loops, edges, and vertices. If you're trying to create a bridge inside of an object and you're having a hard time creating the interior geometry, you can always add a loop cut inside of its face and use the Bevel tool, which again is Control B, to create additional geometry so that you can create your bridge. If you need to delete something quickly, you can use the Dissolve tool by hitting Control X. You can do this with edges or faces, but I find that I mostly use it with certain edges that I don't need, and it's very useful and very quick. It's also very helpful if you have things like hanging geometry that aren't working for your mesh, so you can use the Dissolve tool to get rid of those. So now for animation. If you're going to do animation, you're going to need to make sure that you have a viewport open that has a timeline. You can create more viewports by going to the bottom left of any corner, and you can just sort of pull out that viewport. And for this one, you're going to want to make sure that one of them is set to timeline. To create a keyframe for your animation, hit the I key. And when you create this keyframe, you're going to want to specify whether or not the object that you're animating is only going to be changed in its location, scale, rotation. When you're trying to update your animation keyframe, you're going to want to go down to where it says Visual Location, Rotation, and Scale. This is what you're going to click to update any one of these features in your keyframe. And when you play your animation, you'll notice that the location, scale, or rotation of your object will transition from keyframe to keyframe. This will become more important when we start dealing with things like the graph editor, which we will talk about in a different video. So if you want to use things that aren't the default cube, you monster, we can add geometry with Shift A. This can add shapes like cone, cylinder, rhombus, or torus. And each of these shapes have their own settings in the bottom left-hand corner, where you can add things like additional segments, sides, and allows you to create things like hexagonal or octagonal shapes. When using the grid tool, this can be a very useful way to create things like cityscapes, in which we can extrude a lot of small squares up and around. We can also make indents in the grid so that we can mimic things like sidewalks and gutters. So there are two ways to inset things in Blender, and that's to inset individuals, where each of the individual faces that you have selected inset inside of themselves, whereas you can use something like path selection, and then you can use continuous inset to make it so that you have one full shape. So there are two types of shading in Blender: flat shading and smooth shading, and they both do about what you would expect. This can be important when creating something like a character. Not every one of our characters is going to be geometric and boxy. So you want to use smooth shading whenever you're trying to create something like a curve and you don't want to use a lot of geometry. That would be very expensive. Sometimes we see errors in the shading where there are hard areas that still need to be defined, like the edges around squares and cylinders just sort of get blended over when we go into smooth mode. We can fix this by loop cutting hard edges. By adding loop cuts to the top and bottom of the cylinder, we can create hard edges so that the smoothing knows which areas to shade smooth and which areas to shade flat. To make this whole process simpler, you can also use the Auto Smooth feature, which can be found in the Data Properties panel in the right-hand corner. By selecting this, you can shade all of the appropriate areas that need to be smooth, and all of the areas that are flat will stay flat. Don't ask me how it does this, I'm actually not entirely sure, but dang it if it don't look good. If you want to keep more organized, you can parent objects to other objects to keep them in more of a group and to keep the constraints of your objects consistent. You can do this by hitting Control P after selecting the object that you want to be parented and the object that you're going to parent to. For instance, this was the hexagonal shape. This object is now a parent object of the original, and when I move this object, you'll notice the other one moves with it. This whole system operates in sort of a hierarchy, where if I take this set of parented objects and I try to parent it to the multi-sided face up here, you'll notice that now that is the parent of the hexagonal shape, which is the parent of the cylinder. So it's this big line, and you can make about as many parent groups as you want depending on what you're doing. This is really handy if you're trying to rig something or if you're doing an animatic and you have a lot of objects that have several moving parts. There are many different ways to select objects in Blender that aren't just the classic selection tool. If you hit Shift G, it'll open up the selection menu and you'll be able to do things like select object by type, select the parents or the children of objects, select collections, select by color, lots of stuff. This is a really easy way to determine which of your objects are parented to other ones. To hide an object, hit the H key. If you want to unhide all objects, hit Alt H and everything will come back. Hiding objects becomes increasingly useful if you're working on an object with a bunch of meshes and you just need stuff out of the way. To join an object to another one, select both objects and hit Ctrl J. This will make it so that individual objects are now one solid mesh. Be careful when you do this because once you join an object, it can be difficult to unjoin them. They kind of become one mesh. When you're working on an object, it can be really useful to use multiple viewports so that you can see your object or your scene in a variety of different ways. You can do this by going to the corner of the viewport you're using and you can pull out more viewports and you can set these to things like orthographic, side view. One thing that I like to do is have one of my viewports be in a rendered view so that I don't have to constantly switch back and forth to go from my unshaded view to my final render. Some people also play their animatics in one of the viewport so that they can have it playing on a loop so that they know what things to change and things like that. You're going to be ending up doing this anyway when you get into the other top tabs, things like UV editing and that sort of stuff. So just kind of better to get used to it now. Now I mentioned extruding from normals earlier, which the shortcut for that by the way is Alt E. And this can be really useful for creating dense and hard edges in objects. For instance, we have this little rim that we're making on this chest right here. And this tool works best when you're selecting multiple faces at the same time. When it comes to texturing your objects, it might seem a little counterintuitive at first. In order to do that, we have to add a material, which we can do in the materials tab to the right hand side. It's going to be the one that looks like the little earth thing. You're going to click the plus button to add a material. Now you're going to have to make a new material for each texture that you're going to add to your model or models. This can become a little tedious, but it's worth it in the end, especially when you have a lot of materials that have very different properties. And there are shortcuts around this too, things like texture atlasing, which I'll talk about in another video. But for now, let's just start with material 01. So we're going to apply this material and you'll notice on the right, there are a bunch of options in the right hand drop down. These include things like roughness, metallic, which makes your object shiny or not shiny, specular, translucency, the whole nine. We're not going to talk about all of the features here yet because there are a lot. And when you add in things like the shader editor, your brain goes smooth. So yeah, real quick before we stop talking about this, I want to give a shout out to the emission shader. This is a setting in the material property editor that allows you to add light coming off of objects, and it's amazing and I use it a lot. And when you pair this with things like a scene light, you can create really cool looking lighting. There's a way as well to add multiple materials onto the same mesh, and how this works is you create multiple materials in the right hand tab and then you can select the faces that you want to be the material that you have selected, and then you hit the Assign tab so that those faces will now have the new texture. And by the way, when you change any of the properties of your material, it will change it on your objects as well. And it'll change it for any objects that have the material that you're trying to edit. Using Subsurface in the Materials tab will affect the diffusion of light in your objects, and it is something that can be very effective for making skin. And that just about does it for the basics. There's still more to touch on, and if there's anything that you want to see, make sure to leave a comment to ask those kinds of questions. In the next video, we're going to be talking more about modifiers. Thanks for stopping by my video. If you like using Blender and want to learn more about it, consider checking out channels like Ducky3D, Southern Shoddy, Polyfjord, and Savannah XYZ. You're going to find a lot of great stuff. Like, comment, and subscribe if you're into that kind of thing, and check out my Ko-Fi. That's going to be it for this time, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next video. See you.